Good evening, everybody. This is the WWV Amateur Radio Club, and tonight we have a presentation from Glenn Nelson, AE0GF. He is a retired technician from the WWV, WWVB radio complex and worked for NIST for a very long time, and he's going to give us the history of WWV. So, Glenn, it's really nice to have you here tonight. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Dave. It's nice to be here. Can everyone hear me okay?
I think so. You could talk up a little bit louder, but I think you're doing pretty good.
Okay, I'm using the mic on my MacBook here, so let me
It's
see.
Sounds
working.
really, really good here, as far as I'm
Yeah.
concerned.
Okay,
Five
great.
by nine in Ohio.
Dave, you
Excellent.
might want to mute everybody but the speaker.
Oh yeah, I get to do that, huh? How do I do that?
Well, thank you for having me here, Dave. It's nice to see you folks. Some of you see you again. I am Glenn Nelson, AE0GF, Alpha Echo Zero Golf Foxtrot. I'm a former employee, former technician at radio station WWV and VB in Fort Collins. And I was there from 1997 until last September. I've been retired since last September 30th. So, but it's nice to be here tonight. I worked prior to my employment at NIST, I worked for a defense contractor on the East Coast, and we worked on naval radio transmitters that broadcast to submarines. And some of those transmitters actually ended up at WWVB, and that's kind of how I ended up there. So a little bit about me. So Dave, I have a question for you, and that is, how do I share this slideshow with the folks here on the call? Do I go to share screen?
Yeah, down in the middle of the screen that's got everybody that's here on the call, you should see a little green arrow sticking up. It says share. Do you see that?
I do.
So click on that. And if you have more than one screen, pick the screen that you want to share.
All right. So let's try this. Allow to share. Here we go. This is on a.
And if you have audio, I think there's a button that says share audio as well, maybe.
Okay.
I don't know if you do or not.
Yeah, the only audio is going to be over the microphone here, but
That's all you need then.
can you folks see a
Yes, we've got it. So if you
screen
go
here
ahead and
with-
go to play your slideshow, you should be good.
All righty. Let's see here. Slideshow. How about that?
Perfect. Good.
All right. So yeah, a little bit about me there. All right. What is WWV? We'll start at the beginning here. WWV is one of the broadcasts of Time and Frequency Division at NIST. WWV disseminates standards of time and frequency, and it broadcasts time of day, standard time interval, standard frequencies, and other information from here in Fort Collins, or north of Fort Collins, actually. We operate, I keep saying we, it's not we anymore, they. They operate on 6 shortwave frequencies from 2.5 to 25 megahertz. And the mission is to disseminate time and frequency standards to industry and the public such that at least one WWV frequency may be available at any time, day or night, anywhere in the US. That's the goal. And you can see the antenna field there with the different mostly half-wave dipoles in the field. That was taken in, I think, May. That's why the grass is all green and not brown. It's usually brown. What is NIST? NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, part of the U.S. Department of Commerce. And NIST was originally founded as the National Bureau of Standards in 1901. The earliest radio research was done there in 1905, but this new technology required its own laboratory, and the radio section was founded. The radio section laboratory was founded in 1913. So I'm just going to back out of this for just a moment. So Dave, do you know how I can see my show notes while I'm presenting here? I actually have a few presenter notes on each slide that I can't see in that particular format.
You don't have a second screen, do you?
I don't.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's
Well,
really
the way Dave McCarter here from London, Ontario. The way you see your presentation notes is you have two screens. You
mhm.
present to screen two, and you then see your notes on screen one.
Okay, so I actually have two physical separate screens then, it
What I
sounds like.
discovered you have to do is exactly that. You have to have two screens, your laptop screen and another plugged in screen. And then when you're choosing the screen to show, you have to make sure you get the right one.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll
so
just wing
so
it
that
then.
so that's an idea. Why don't you go ahead and quit sharing for a second
Okay.
and then start your slideshow.
If you have another screen that you can plug in, an external screen to your laptop, then you're good to go. Otherwise, no.
Yeah, I think with this MacBook here, I don't think I
So
have
my suggestion is if you go ahead and you start you're not sharing your screen, right?
yeah, I'm still sharing it at the moment here. All right, I am
Stop
stopping
sharing.
the
Yeah.
share.
Okay. So go ahead now. Start your slideshow and see if you get both the presentation and your notes.
Right.
See
Let's
if you
see
get
here.
both of those on the same screen if you start your slide program. And
No,
you're
I'm
not sharing
afraid
it
not.
yet. You're
Right.
just going to
No.
go up and show it.
Right. So I'm looking at the slide presentation here and I don't see my notes. You know what? That's okay.
Well,
We'll just
before you give up, go up to share your screen or
okay.
go to the part that says share screen again
Right.
and
Hmm.
see if you don't have two windows. One's your notes and then one's the
Okay.
presentation.
So I can share a window or I can share a screen. So I could try.
So try to share the window of the presentation
Okay. Let's see
and see if
here.
you don't happen to get your notes popping up as well.
All right. Um, no, that doesn't. I can only share one window at a time here. And
Well,
so,
the only window you want to share is your presentation and not anything else.
right. Okay.
What Dave
Yeah, share the
McCarter's
window,
saying is
not the
correct.
not your screen.
You just want to share the window that is the presentation if you have that option.
Okay. Yeah, I am not seeing that I can get to that from here on
Okay.
this laptop. So that's all right. I've been through this a few times, so we'll just wing that and
If you forget something, I'll fill it in for you,
yeah.
Glenn.
Yeah, there may be people here who could help me with that. Okay.
uh,
All right. Well, apologize for the technical difficulties here.
no
Um,
worries.
uh, I'm going to
I
try.
suppose I could probably show it here, and you could tell me when to flip.
Yeah, we'll just
Did
go
you
with this.
change it? Did you change the presentation at all?
I did slightly. I edited a few
Okay,
slides.
so I don't have it anymore. All
Yeah,
right, go
that's
for it.
okay. Yeah, we'll just carry on here. Okay, so we are at this slide, and we are going to view the slideshow. Very good. All right.
Sweet.
So, yes, Dave, were you going to say something?
No, you got it.
All
You're
right,
good.
great. Cool. Okay, so back in the day, for some reason my mouse is here. There we go. Back in those days before World War One and the early days of radio, broadcasting as we know it really wasn't a thing. It was not widely practiced. Most of the radio traffic was messages, point-to-point communication between individuals or organizations such as military transmissions. One of the things you could do, though, was to send a radio telegraph. This is a very large. This station here, I forget exactly where it is. It's in the U.S., I believe, somewhere, and it is operated by a company like Marconi or the Federal. I think it was the Federal Radio and Telegraph Corporation. But these are big businesses that operated these stations, and they were there to send signals across the oceans. This is an example of a radio telegraph message that was captured on a paper tape by what's called a siphon recorder. It was received in New York in 1920. And this device is kind of interesting. It would actually, it operated as a strip chart. It would actually record the dits and das, and for visual decoding here. And that's the message there, Berlin, urgent. And this traffic came from a station in Nauen, a place called Nauen in Germany. And that station is actually still there. It's pretty interesting to look it up. I checked it out on Wikipedia, and it's still there. It's still in operation. I believe it's a government-owned facility. And after World War I, audio began to be explored as something that could profitably be transmitted over the radio waves. And here's an article from a newspaper from February of 1919, and it describes visitors to the National Bureau of Standards. They're sitting in an auditorium, and they were listening to a receiver that played a song called Pretty Baby. Apparently, it was a popular song at the time, and it would actually send that signal several hundred yards from a station laboratory or from a laboratory to the auditorium where people were listening, and they were amazed. It made the newspapers. It was a novelty to have to have audio and music and voice being transmitted during that time period. But WWV itself, the first record I could find in my research of WWV came from October 1st in 1919. And it came from the Radio Service Bulletin, which you see a image here of one of the pages. This was a bulletin that was published every month back in those days, in the early days of radio. The Department of Commerce was actually the agency in charge of managing licensing for radio stations. And so they would publish every new station that came on the air, or that actually every new license that was granted was published in this bulletin. And many of them were ships. The ones that began with the letter N were often a Navy or a government station. But you can see down here at the bottom right, WWV listed as an experimental station. Another important, another thing about this date that's important is that this is when the government ban on radio transmission or receiving was lifted. During World War I, during the U.S. participation in World War I, all radio broadcasting and receiving was banned. It was actually prohibited. It was illegal to turn, if you had a receiver, it was illegal to turn it on, and you couldn't listen. This was for security reasons. It was viewed as a security threat that German or enemy spies could actually broadcast or send messages from the U.S. So the only people that were allowed on the air were the military and the government. But you could see, obviously, since the experiment we just talked about was in October or February of 1919, it didn't apply to the government. Early audio experiments, though, use this setup right here. This is a state-of-the-art in 1919 setup for broadcasting audio. The transmitter on the left there is I believe that's an Army transmitter from World War I, and there was a telephone microphone connected to it with the horn that you see, and that was basically placed right up against a wind-up record player called a Victrola. If you ever go up to the YMCA in Estes Park, they have a museum there. It's a really interesting museum, actually, for a number of reasons. But it's a reconstruction of one of the original lodges that tourists would come and stay in Estes Park at the YMCA, and they have one of these Victrolas there. They'll actually play it for you. They don't have the transmitter though. But by the spring of 1920, evening concerts were being broadcast at WWV. These were the first regularly scheduled broadcasts on the station. They used a transmitter built by the radio station or the radio section staff, the radio laboratory. And the purpose of this transmitter was to determine the range of the signals that were going out. We don't have a record of what that particular antenna looked like, but this was their transmitter. Notice the vacuum tubes on top. That was one of the innovations that led to audio being practically being able to be broadcast with some kind of intelligibility or fidelity. So this was a big step. By the way, the range of those early signals was around 40 kilometers, a few miles back in those days. But even back then, the NBS and ARRL collaborated to provide an opportunity for amateurs to contribute to radio science. And in this case, there were a number of shortwave radio signal fading studies done. We'd call them propagation studies these days, but trying to explore and do research into why certain signals faded at certain times of the day and night, and amateurs were enlisted to basically send more elaborate reception reports to the National Bureau of Standards. The gentleman who coordinated these studies was named Cruz, S. Cruz, and he was an engineer at NBS, but also an amateur, W1BAO, and he actually went on to a career at ARRL. In the early 1920s, the radio boom had really taken off. The ban on broadcasting had been lifted. Vacuum tubes were available and made audio broadcast practical. Many commercial stations took to the air, along with hundreds of amateurs that were back on the air at that time as well, mostly with code. But the result was massive interference. The stations could not keep from talking over each other or sending their signals and interfering with each other. The broadcasters had a great deal of difficulty staying on their assigned frequencies. The interference was rampant, and there was a great need for easily obtained frequency standards. This is a newspaper clipping from that era. And one solution was WWV. The government directed the Department of Commerce and NBS to explore frequency standards and broadcasting them. That by this time, NBS had developed some accurate for that day frequency standards, and they began broadcasting on March of 1923. The broadcast used a 1 kilowatt transmitter. The range was about 1,000 miles, 1,600 kilometers. Standard frequencies were from 200 kilohertz to 2,000 kilohertz were broadcast from 11 to 1:15 a.m. twice a month. And so the idea was that the signals would not interfere with the normal broadcasting hours of commercial radio stations at that time. But they also enabled the stations to calibrate their broadcasting, their transmitting equipment against a known frequency standard, and these helped these stations stay on the air at their assigned frequencies. Here's a picture, kind of a famous picture of the early antennas at WWV from the early 1920s. Pretty large antennas, really, thinking about antennas today. The higher frequencies were from the smaller T-shaped antenna on the left, and that which we only see part of, and then that larger one is the lower frequencies, of course. In the 1930s, WWV, it was realized that the signals that were being transmitted from right there from the laboratories were starting to interfere with the other experimental work that was going on and research that was going on in that building or in that area. And so WWV was moved to suburban Maryland, first to College Park and then Beltsville, Maryland in 1932. In this building, it looks like a house. The antennas that you see there are actually retouched. They're basically wires, horizontal dipoles, but they have been accentuated to be able to see them in the picture. A new 30 kilowatt transmitter was purchased, and then 5 megahertz, 10 and 15 megahertz were added to the frequencies that were broadcast. Initially only on Tuesdays, and then later three days a week. The potential coverage area was increased quite a bit. In 1935, some more features of the broadcast started to look a little bit more like we recognize today. There were audio tones added, 1 kilohertz, and then 440 hertz, which is A above middle C, was added in 1936. This was very popular at the time among musicians and music stores and piano tuners and folks who needed to have a portable frequency standard in the form of a tuning fork, and they could calibrate their tuning equipment with WWV. We still broadcast 440 hertz. There I go again. They still broadcast 440 hertz, A above middle C, once an hour. I believe it's minute 3, 3 minutes past the top of the hour, for about 45 seconds. But also seconds pulses, ionospheric conditions, and audio voice announcements were added in that time frame. But in 1940, disaster struck. WWV building burned to the ground on November 6th of 1940. Kind of amazingly, though, the standard frequency equipment in the basement was recovered, and WWV was back on the air in less than a week with a standby transmitter that was located in another building. I don't know for sure, but I have a feeling it was probably the original transmitter that was brought back, or at least an older one. But just one transmitter broadcast on 5 megahertz at 1 kilowatt. That's it as far as the frequency range, but it would now be operated continuously 24/7. And in those along in that same time frame, seconds pulses that were being broadcast were synchronized with U.S. Naval Observatory time. And that's important because the USNO was responsible at that time for disseminating the time of day to the public. And NBS was responsible for maintaining frequency standards, but the two really go hand in hand, and that was a recognition by USNO. So in the early 1940s, Congress approved $230,000 for a new radio station back in those days, and construction began a short distance away from the old site. And this station was completed in 1943. The station used half-wave dipoles that were suspended from wooden poles and fed with balanced transmission lines. You can kind of see one there on the left side of that frame, or left side of the image, perhaps. The location name was changed to Greenbelt from Maryland, from Beltsville, Maryland. And Matt and I both have visited this building now. It is actually part of the Goddard Space Flight Center, part of NASA. and that building has been expanded and enlarged significantly. It's actually the visitor center for the Goddard Space Flight Center now. It's very interesting.
Hey, Glenn, I'm going to
Yes.
interrupt real quick. When we had the 2019 event and we had the ceremony at WWV, the
Yes.
folks at Goddard Space Center, they gathered in the auditorium of that building and they watched our program. I had videotaped it and sent it to them, or I was videoing it and we
Yeah, I
sent it to
remember
them.
that.
So,
Okay.
so
Cool.
that room was used to to celebrate the 100th anniversary of WWV. So that was pretty
Yeah,
neat.
that's really cool. There's one guy that works there. I can't remember his name right now, but I don't think he's an amateur operator, but he's a WWV enthusiast. And he has a file of information that they have on WWV, like some of these pictures that I'm showing you here. And he actually gave us, my son and I visited there, gave us kind of a guided tour behind the scenes, and he took us behind a kind of a fake wall, and there was the original wall with the windows that you see there. They were boarded up, but you could still see the original interior of the wall of this room that we're looking at right here. That's really cool. But this was a state of the art facility at the time, and those transmitters that you see there were broadcasting on 5, 10, and 15 megahertz, and they added more at a later time. This station could cover most of North America from this facility, from this location, and fair reception over most of the world in general at all times throughout the U.S. It says here that's what they said anyway. And in 1944, the USNO officially granted permission to WWV to broadcast the time of day. And so instead of just seconds pulses, there were actually the time of day was being broadcast at that point. In the 1940s and 1950s, we have some new developments. WWVH began broadcasting in 1948 from Maui in Hawaii, and later moved to the island of Kauai. But in 1950, WWV begins the voice time of day announcements. Prior to that time, they had been in Morse code only, but they were audio, but they were Morse code. In 1956, KK2XEI was an experimental 60 kilohertz LF station that went on the air in Boulder, which was later renamed WWVB. And Matt was telling you about that. It sounds like at a recent meeting. By the 1960s, WWV was critical infrastructure. It was widely used by the military, by industrial, commercial, educational, amateur, and private users. I can't tell you how many times, a number of times, I've talked with a veteran, and I tell him where I worked or used to work. He said, "Oh yes, we used you to help navigate, or we use you for our operations in some way." And it was a vital piece of infrastructure for the military at that time prior to GPS. A digital time code was added to WWV in 1960. A digital um, audio time code, but the station was located far away from users in the Western U.S. And it was starting to get old. And so in the 1960s, here's a view of the WWV and WWVL antennas. This is an artist's conception. Matt may have shown you this. These stations were set up in Fort Collins at a new facility in Fort Collins. Both of them were originally frequency references only, and of course we had VB at 60 kilohertz and VL at 20 kilohertz. In 1966, WWV headed west. There was a new building constructed at the VB and VL site in Fort Collins. It was $1 million for that station back then. All new transmitters, all new timing equipment, all new antennas. The only parts that were brought from the old station in Maryland were the concrete call letters that you see there. They were on the old building back in Greenbelt. The new station broadcasts on 2.5, 5, 10, 15, 20, and 25 megahertz. That's where they broadcast today. Over the period of time that we mentioned between then and I think it was 2014, the government actually explored dropping some of these frequencies from or discontinuing some of these frequencies from broadcast just for cost savings. And for a time, 20 megahertz for a short time, and then 25 megahertz for a number of years were discontinued. But those have been restored. 20 megahertz was brought back on. I think it was the late 70s when this happened that the government explored discontinuing those two. 20 megahertz was brought back after a few months, but 25 megahertz was restored in I believe it was 2014. So WWV radiates 10 kilowatts on 5, 10, and 15 megahertz and 2.5 kilowatts on the other frequencies. And again, these are all omnidirectional antennas, halfway vertical dipoles. There are 2 broadband antennas that can operate on any WWV frequency as well. There are some QSL cards over the years. QSLs are what we don't see here is the latest version of that card, but there is a newer one that you may be aware of. From the 1980s, GPS systems came online and provided precision timing for laboratory and industrial use and for military use. And WWV could not provide the level of precision that the GPS could provide. But it was still widely used in those days and still is to some extent. WWV got new transmitters for 5, 10, and 15 megahertz in 1990. And GPS common view techniques were used to keep the cesium oscillators synchronized to UTC NIST. And two-way satellite time transfer experiments began with the USNO and with Australia in the 1990s. Those satellite dishes you see on the lawn there were installed for that purpose. There was talk of actually they were used. I guess the last time they were used was in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And there was talk of starting that program up again, but I'm not sure where that is. This is a image of page 1 of the paper that I wrote back in 2019 about WWV, and we've got I can get, if you're interested in that, there's a link here, I believe, that Dave has on the email and the website about that paper if you'd like to read it. So that concludes my presentation. And I'm here to answer any questions you might have.
Well, I'm Fred, W9KEY. I'll kick it off with a question. Glenn, can you hear me?
I can. Hi, Fred. Good to see you again.
Hello, good to see you, and thanks so much for another great update. I just finished a couple days ago a book that probably half the people here have already read. It's called 200 Meters and Down, and it's published by ARRL. It was written in 1936 by a guy named Clinton DeSoto, and I was troubled. It's a very interesting look at the beginning of amateur radio, all of the government interaction that happened, and the fact that as amateurs, we're lucky we have any bands at all. And when you read that book, but I was very troubled, and I was specifically looking in his book for references to WWV, and I never found any. And I found that curious. And I guess I'm just asking if you have any background. I would have thought that the time and frequency measurements would have been critical to the amateurs of that day, and some mention would have been made in the book, which, as I said, was written in 1936 as a history, but it wasn't there.
That is interesting. I have a copy of that book. I started it, but I haven't finished it yet. I'm looking forward to checking it out. I got it at a Hamfest here recently. But I can tell you that amateurs were certainly um, there was a lot of opportunities for them to learn about WWV. You may have seen the slide that had the ARRL fading study that was done in 1920, and those went for I think 7 years. And the guy who coordinated that study for MBS actually left WWV, left the radio section, and went to work for ARRL. So there were definitely um, connections between those two agencies. Um, but I can't explain why this author didn't mention WWV. I can tell you a little bit more about the history of WWV that's might be a little bit related. And one of the things that happened in the mid 1920s at about that 1926 27 timeframe is that there were several other uh, frequency standard frequency stations on the air in the U.S. at that time, and one of these was at Stanford University. One of them was operated by the Gold Medal Flour Company in Minneapolis. There was another one operated by the Elgin Watch Company. I think it was in Chicago. There were not a lot, but there were quite a number of frequency standard stations, and all of these were able to trace their frequency references to NBS somehow, and whether that was through WWV or by another means, I'm not sure. But there was actually a move in the mid 1920s to shut WWV down because these other um, resources existed at that point. And of course, at that time, and even today, there's been this conversation over the years, over the decades. At the time, WWV or MBS was a research organization, and WWV was perceived as a service. There was a lot of research that was done using WWV. In fact, when the National Bureau of Standards moved to or opened their Boulder laboratory, they opened it as the radio laboratory, and that the main building in Boulder was called the radio building. And so, a long history of research at WWV using WWV and other time and frequency broadcasts. But that argument has resurfaced over the years from time to time that NBS or NIST is a research organization, and there are others in the group or in the organization that say, well, we also provide services, and so there's always been a little bit of that tension there.
I thought it was interesting that in shortly after the 2019 event, really before the COVID event happened, in February of that year of 2020, there was a presidential directive put together that said, we want to know what you could do to provide your services in case there was a loss of the GPS system. And you were involved in writing that article, weren't you?
Well, my colleague Mike Lombardi was, I think, primary author in that, or one of them. But yes, I think I provided some support for that document as well. But yeah, it is interesting that actually there was an earlier that topic had come up again earlier in that administration, but by that time, by 2019 or 2020, you're right. That was a request from that administration. See what you can do to provide backup to GPS, essentially.
But it was a good opportunity for you and the station to make a good argument why you exist.
That's
Correct?
right. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was really good. And then the other thing that happened when you got to the end of your career, you actually stayed a little longer than you thought you were going to be at WWV. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, I was originally shooting for retiring at age 62. That would have been a couple of years ago, but and it wasn't the only reason. But I really wanted to uh, try to help. There was only four staff members at the station, and so an engineer, three technicians, and when a fourth of the staff goes away, then that leaves a burden on the other three. And so I wanted to stick around until my replacement was hired, and wanted to try to play a part in training him. And so I was able to do that, thankfully. It took a long time to get this guy, or to get a person hired. It wasn't limited to men in particular, but that's who we ended up with. And the technician that came on has got as it seems to be doing very well. I hope he gets to stay. And in this climate right now, we don't know. But when I checked with Matt, I actually saw Matt this morning. He's still working there, so hopefully he'll get to stay.
But you spent, boy, you had an overlap with him of what, 4 or 5 months, maybe even longer?
Well, actually, it ended up being 2 months, but that's
Shorter than you
okay.
wanted. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's okay. I felt like I was able to. At the same time, I didn't. I did not get uh, as much time dedicated to training as I would have liked, because we had an antenna on the ground. If you might remember from WWVB, we had a one of the two WWV and VB antennas failed in I want to say March of
April.
20, was it April
Yeah.
2024? Yeah. So big windstorm. And so for quite a while there, all our efforts were dedicated to getting that thing back in operation. So we spent a
And
lot of
hiring
time with that.
somebody at the same time.
And
That's a
hiring,
lot to
yeah.
do.
And it ended up being the lot of the work on the antenna was contracted out. And so in any case though, but I was able to stay on another year. It certainly benefited me in other ways to do that. So no complaints.
Yeah. Very good.
Uh,
Well, welcome to the retirement side of things.
yeah,
Thank you.
it's great. Glenn, I
You
have
get
another.
busier.
Yeah.
I have another. It's a question and a comment, I guess, at the same time. I'm not sure how active you are as a ham on HF, but since the 2019 100th anniversary, our club has held an annual special event station right around October 1st, commemorating the anniversary of WWV, and we've done it each year. Of course, we had the big one in Fort Collins in 2019, but since then we have run from home stations using members that are here in this presentation. And the thing that has struck me every year that we've operated that is the number of hams that'll come on and tell us stories about how important WWV has been to them over the years.
Mm.
And I want to invite you, if you have any interest at all, to participate. I think we're going to continue to do that on the October birthdays, usually for that weekend. And I think you would be amazed and probably very gratified by the stories that you hear and the fact that you played part of that.
Oh, thank you, Fred, for that invitation and for those kind words. I can tell you, as one of the guys who handled the mail at WWV, both postal mail and email, um, I was privileged to work for an organization that actually had fans, and we were one of the few federal agencies that had literal fans who appreciated and truly loved what we did. And there's maybe more than one here tonight. Dave is one of the biggest ones in terms of his efforts. But and we it was really some of those folks would just write and just tell us exactly what you said, that I started listening to you when I was X years old as a kid, and I've grown up and I'm 65 years old or older. And I just want you to know how much we appreciate what you do there. And I'll tell you what, there aren't many things that are more gratifying in a career than to see that kind of thing coming unsolicited from the general public.
I
Um,
and what I found is when they're telling their stories on the air, even though we had active pileups going, the air it would quiet down while those guys were telling those stories, and people across the U.S., maybe across the world, I don't know,
Right.
were listening to those stories, and
yeah.
it's just it's so gratifying every year when we do that
Hmm.
special event. So I hope you can join us next time and hear some of them yourself. And I tell you, if anybody found out that you were had the history and background at the station, the pileup would be even bigger.
Oh boy. Well, I don't want to cause any problems, but but I
No,
could.
Well,
those are good problems. That's what we look for.
Well,
Fred, I
I
got to tell you, we this last time, October 1st, 2024, that was Glenn's last day on the job. Or that was your first day of retirement, right?
actually first day of retirement. That's right.
First day of retirement was October 1st. And we had plans to get him on the air, and I was going to go up to the station and we were going to operate from up there. What happened? I can't remember. Something in my family or
Yeah, I
something
think you
happened
you
and
had
it
a family
derailed our
member
plans.
who was moving or so, but you were called away, and
Yeah,
you
I ended up going up to the Northwest or something, I think that weekend, helping my
right.
kids out with something. But
Way
yeah,
to
we'll
go,
get you on
Dad.
this next year, though.
Okay.
So I can throw in a couple things here. Too. I'm Rob. I moved to the DC area about 35 years ago, and I can add some local color for the places that you mentioned. When I moved here, I imagined that Beltsville might have something to do with the Beltway. And that, of course, is not the case because it existed long before the Beltway, because WWV moved there in the 30s. It was named, it was
Right.
a railway
That's right.
station on the B&O that was named after Truman Belt, who was a tobacco farmer. And that was the Baltimore and Ohio main line that paralleled US Route 1, which is where Samuel F.B. Morse put his telegraph line between Baltimore and Washington that he sent What Hath God Wrought on.
How about that?
And when when the location got renamed Greenbelt, that was because Greenbelt was an experimental community that was built in the 1930s. It was championed, it was a planned community that was championed by Eleanor Roosevelt. So
Hmm.
that's how that name change came about. Uh, I,
Interesting.
I had I used to live across the street from Goddard Space Flight Center, and I had no idea that the original transmitter building had been incorporated into the visitor center. I figured it got torn down or something, so I'll have to go there now and check it out.
Yeah, I would recommend that. And ask around about WWV, and if he still works there, the guy who we talked with will gladly come up and chat with you about that. He was very enthusiastic about his about sharing what he knew about WWV. But I could also recommend there's a very interesting museum that you may have heard of in Bowie. It's the Museum of Broadcasting.
I
And
have I caused I was helping a friend's widow clean out the house, and they one of the things that we found was Kathy thought it was, oh, this is just a junky old transistor radio, and it's like, no, Kathy, that's a Regency TR1. You should send it over to somebody. Let me suggest these guys, and they didn't want it, but they knew someone who did.
yeah,
So,
great. Yeah, they may already have one.
oh,
They have,
they already had like two. There's a limit to how many of a particular artifact you want, but
yeah,
that was the first transistor radio ever.
right. Yeah,
What?
I could.
Where's that location? What is it?
Bowie,
It's in
Bowie,
Bowie.
east of DC, east of Greenbelt. Keep going on 193, and you end up in Bowie.
Okay, good.
Yes, a Museum of Radio and Television Broadcasting. It's in a house actually, but it's inside. It's filled with um, radio and television technology from the very beginning to the present day. They actually have, I think they call it a cat whisker receiver that didn't have a, I don't think it had a battery, but it had
Oh, a
basically, it was a
crystal radio. Yeah.
crystal radio. Yeah.
Yeah. Chunk
You
of
could
galena
actually,
and a tiny little wire catch was.
exactly, had a pair of
Yeah.
headphones, and they have one there that you can, from, I mean, from the 1920s that you can listen to. So
I mean,
worth a trip.
we do museums here like few others do, although I think our northern friends in Ottawa have us beat in terms of museums per, per capita or per square kilometer or whatever you want to use as an index. But we also have things like the National Cryptological Museum, which of course, being at NSA, they have lots of radio related artifacts as well. Just a whole bunch of cool stuff to see.
That's very
Lots
neat.
of stuff to see.
All right.
I'm going to stick my face in here and just say, yeah, I grew up in Halifax and Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, and hung around a radio station there for a bit of time when I was a kid. I helped out stacking discs and bulk erasing carts and that kind of thing. And we had a receiver, a shortwave receiver, a Hallicrafters, that was used for one purpose only, and that was to pick up WWV so we could keep the station clocks exact, right? And I have the receivers that were used at London Airport, not very far from where I am right now, that again were tuned to one frequency, a 5 megahertz and a 10 megahertz. And they were used to put a time code on the log that was used to record all of the aircraft and ground control communications. But
Mm.
the number one use of WWV is in astronomy. Astronomers around the world need to know exactly what time it is, so they know where to point their telescopes and expect to see the star or galaxy that they're pointed at.
Mm.
And way back, oh, I guess it should be 95 or 94, there was a big Leonid meteor shower expected. And a bunch of astronomers went to Mongolia because that's where the peak was expected. And they used a shortwave radio tuned to WWV at 15 megahertz to keep them on track for the time. And that time code was actually recorded onto the audio track of a videotape that was running with a number of video cameras with image intensifiers to record the shower. So, yeah, kind of useful. Kind of
Yeah, that
useful.
I've heard of that, Dave. And actually, Matt, I don't know if you were here for Matt Deutsch's
Yep.
presentation, but
Yep.
he's also kind of an astronomy buff, and
Right.
he's I don't know if he's actually used that particular technique, but he certainly knows about it. But yeah,
Absolutely.
a lot of uses um, that we don't realize. And I remember getting one that one of the times when there was a discussion about shutting the station down. I got a call at the station one day, and it was from a Navy radio technician, or a Navy electronics technician, I should say, in Bangor, Washington, and I think it was Bangor. And she was telling me she was very concerned. She said her chief was very concerned that the station was going to be shut down, and she wanted to know some details. And I told her what I knew, and then I asked her, "Well, how do you use the frequencies or the broadcast?" And she said, "Well, I really can't tell you." And so there we are. But we know that they're used.
There
Um,
you go. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I mean, I remember quite clearly discovering WWV, tuning around an old Hallicrafters S38C that my dad brought back from Chicago in 54. And of course, that back then, it was Greenbelt, Maryland.
mhm.
And so I kind of associated WWV early on with that. And I was in Flagstaff at the Lowell Observatory, and sitting at the base of the telescope mount was another S38C, And when I looked at the dial, it was tuned to 5 megahertz.
How
So
about that?
yeah, but mind you, of course, on a lonely night when you're sitting there, you tune the radio off and find a shortwave broadcaster and listen to them for a while, or go onto the AM band and listen to that for a while. But then you got to check your clock, and you're going to go, yeah, there you go.
Ah, yes.
A quick question, not to get away from WWV, but Dave, when did CHU up in Canada come online? Was that about shortly after the 20s, 1920s, or was it,
It was,
do you
I
know when?
think, 1924, something like that.
Okay,
Yeah,
and it's been
it was
on
quite
since
early.
then as well,
But
correct?
we discussed some time ago the possibility of celebrating the 100th anniversary of CHU. And when I looked into it, I discovered that had already passed.
Ah, all right.
So yeah, yeah.
Yep.
My big question to Glenn and to anybody who's interested is, how did they establish that that was 5 megahertz or that was 2.5 megahertz? I know from my research that radio inspectors had wave meters, calibrated wave meters, and that was just a coil and a capacitor and a detector and a little meter, and basically a crystal radio, but with a known coil and a known capacitor and a calibration chart. But I've always puzzled, how the hell did they calibrate the wave meter? And so, and have not been able to find anything in the record that was quite definitive.
Well, I know what you're talking about as far as the wave meters, and the only thing I can tell you is that they had another wave meter. That's, but I think with some mathematics, they could probably look at the components and figure out what they were supposed to be, and then I don't know exactly how those were calibrated because there really wasn't there wasn't a lot else to calibrate them to or against. But I can tell you that in the late 1920s and early 30s, I believe it was when crystal oscillators first became the frequency stability of the crystal oscillator became known, and that's when crystal oscillators were used as the primary frequency standard at NEST, and for many years, decades. In fact, in um, Boulder, when the Boulder Labs were established in mid 1950s, I think it was 1954. Someone was telling me that there is actually a concrete lined shaft into the hillside there on the Boulder Labs, and it goes down quite deep. Uh, oh, probably 20, 30 feet at least. And at the bottom of that pit, that shaft, that's where the frequency oscillators were kept because it was a stable location and the temperature was very stable at that time. And air conditioning systems, I guess I don't know exactly why they put them down there as opposed to an air conditioned space, but that's where they were kept originally.
Yeah, yeah.
I have a
The
device
idea of
to,
warming up a crystal, the warming up a crystal to 65 degrees C, came a bit later.
Mm.
Yeah, I know that pendulums were used to keep time, and some pendulums operating in a vacuum, electronically triggered, and so on. Very, very accurate. Certainly pretty good. They'd lose a second in a year, but um, yeah, the whole thing of okay, how do you actually know that that's 100 kilohertz? Did you count every cycle? How do you know that, right? So yeah, yeah,
Mm.
I'm going to continue to look into that, but kind of a puzzle. Anyway, thank you, Glenn. Great talk.
Well, thank
um,
you.
I was going to
That
bring
raises
up
the
a
question.
calibration instrument that you may not know about. They're called Letcher
We'll get to Dave.
wires.
Letcher wires. Is that what?
Indeed, yeah, but you need
Letcher
to know the
wires, which is a
application.
set of wires with
Yeah,
a variable short and some kind of indicator. And you could measure wavelength with that and presumably could calibrate it and measure it quite accurately.
yeah,
You
but
put
can you
enough power
imagine a
and you
set
can
of
actually see
Lecce
them move.
wires for 60 kilohertz?
Well, that's what I'm thinking. It'd be higher frequencies, but
very higher frequencies.
There
I
are
mean,
ways of measuring the wavelength.
yeah,
Hey,
I've
there's a
used lead
question
wire.
from Keith Griner. Keith, did you have a question?
Yeah, I had a comment and a question that when I grew up with another ham radio operator in the house who was my dad. He'd been around since, oh gosh, a long, long time. But we had a, this is before I can remember, as you can imagine, but we had actually a crystal oscillator that was a frequency standard that we could compare to WWV, put both of them on the receiver at the same time, and you could tell the difference. And then I knew a guy at a local AM station who would put those onto an oscilloscope and show them as a moving circle, and he could tell when the two were resonated based on the flops of the circle. That was one of the things that made me really interested in all of this, is to say that that was actually possible.
Those were, this is Mike Lombardi. Those were
Hey,
lizard
Mike,
juice patterns.
what was that
Yeah,
called?
I think it's pronounced lizard juice patterns.
Yeah, I
I
think you're
used
right,
to,
Mike.
Yeah,
when I
lizard
first started
patterns.
at the Bureau of Standards, my boss showed me how to do that. And you can do it with any dual trace scope.
Liaisonous patterns, and you can look at harmonics by counting the number of nodes. Yeah, but you
That's
still
how
The
need
you
a
can
scope
see
goes
the
reference.
back a
phase,
long way.
and
So
you can see the phase loop on that too, right? Can't you see the phase?
yeah,
Yes.
you basically you either count the rotations and you bring frequencies together by when the patterns stop rotating.
Yeah, if it's a circle, they're the same.
Yeah,
I
the
recall.
circle.
Or a straight line.
And
You
also,
Very
just don't
interesting.
want it
Very
to
cool.
change.
Yeah.
I saw
The
in the chat.
the crystal oscillators were really the key to getting everything to work really well, though, right? That was the most steady that they had compared to the waveguides, was the crystal
Yeah,
Well,
oscillator.
so
there are still
those
crystal
vacuum
oscillators.
pendulums can be quite accurate.
Right.
Yeah, there are still
I think
crystal oscillators in those cesium clocks. They are phase locked to the
Oh yeah,
cesium
absolutely.
signal. Yeah,
It's amazing though that even there's most radios that were built for up until recently didn't have any crystal oscillator in them. They just had an LC oscillator with a variable capacitor.
Huh.
So you
Yeah,
didn't
and
really
they
need to be that
drifted.
accurate to tune an AM station.
Right.
the only common atomic standard that I know that is a direct oscillator, not a phase locked system, is the active maser. All the others have an oscillator that's locked to the physical system.
It raises the point for me is that when you have a cesium or a atomic clock, is how do you actually count the number of cycles to get to the definition?
I could try to answer that. Let me see if I can turn my you you have a quartz oscillator that you adjust until the maximum number of atoms change their energy state. So you basically, once you reach that point where you optimize the beam current, you know that you're on the cesium frequency. In the case of cesium, which is the 9192631,770 hertz.
Yeah, and that's because the frequency that frequency is a known standard, right? And so you tune your equipment to that frequency, and when it maxes when your signal is maximum, you're on that frequency. Is that right, Mike?
Peak it up.
Yes.
You peak up the beam current.
Yeah, you have a frequency synthesizer going up from either 5 or 10 megahertz oscillator. And the fact is that our second is defined as a certain certain counts of the cesium frequency. So you actually are working it backwards. So you set your synthesizer to that frequency, lock it to the cesium resonance, and then you know that you're on, your oscillator is locked to whatever it is, exactly 10 megahertz.
This sounds like we're
So
going to
that-
have to. Go ahead, Mike.
Just one of the big things about, one of the big obstacles when they first built atomic clocks is they had to build microwave frequency synthesizers, which was not easy to do. And in fact, they couldn't do it until the 1940s. And we had to be able to do that. I have one real quick thing too, because I was reading the chat about the book Splitting the Second, and I have it here, and it is a great book. It does mention WWV. Am I on that screen?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we can see it, Mike.
And then on these questions about CHU, this is a fantastic book, The Beginning of the Long Dash.
The beginning of what?
The Long Dash.
Yeah, hold the book
Beginning
up,
of the long
Mike.
dash.
Hold
Can
the
you
book
see
up,
it?
Mike.
Further back, we just
Back.
seeing thought.
Higher.
Higher.
Higher?
There we
There
go.
you go.
There it is.
Okay. Yeah, it's a terrific book, and it mentions WWV a lot. So, and it's the history of timekeeping in Canada. It's just a great book.
Very neat.
And then I'll
And
shut up.
folks,
Thanks.
if folks don't know who Mike is the former, recently retired and was the head of the time realization group, and he was Glenn and Matt Deutsch's boss for a little while. So, Mike,
Yep.
it's nice to see you and have your contributions. Anytime you want to come in, you've got lots of history to share with us too. So,
And even more important, Mike, I'm sure didn't notice it, but he and I worked on FT8 a few days ago, or maybe it was last week. And I recognized his call sign, but unfortunately on FT8 I couldn't say anything. So
yeah.
hello, Mike.
Well, that's terrific. Thank you. I'm addicted to FTA.
So
One of the people that we're going to have to, one of the
No.
people I was thinking we're going to have to give a talk, since we're all talking about how you find the second, we're going to have Jeff Sherman come back and visit with our group and tell us about optical clock combs and everything else, that getting away from the vibrating objects and getting into the optics to determine time. And so that's the newest area that they're doing work in. And from what I understood, they're getting fairly close to redefining the second. And so that'll be very interesting when that does finally come around.
There was a paper published not long ago that it can only be redefined when this group called the CGPM meets. And it meets every 4 years. But this paper infers that it'll either be redefined in 2030, 2034, or 2038.
Okay.
So
Well,
it's
I
not
hope
too
you
I
hurry
would-
up because we're losing time.
Yeah, am I going to get older or younger when that happens? That's what I want to know.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully we make it to see those. But
Yeah.
but it's not going to happen in 2026, which is the next meeting.
That's too bad.
A question for Glenn, back to WWV. I assume that the original intent of the station was to provide time and frequency to, let's say, North America. Have there been propagation studies as to how far around the world people relied on WWV? I would expect that you had coverage into Europe, South America, and places.
It has coverage
Has there
into
been any
Antarctica.
propagation studies made?
It has coverage into Antarctica.
Yeah, that's right. As far as I know, there haven't been any formal propagation studies done as far as reaching out to worldwide listeners, but that actually is one reason why we offer QSL cards. And from the very beginning, we wanted to WWV wanted to hear from our listeners and just to get an idea of what the range was. Actually, even in 1920, that was one of the purposes of the station. And now I can tell you that we get, and there I go saying we again, but the station gets QSL cards from all over the world, and indeed from um, the South Pole. I was at a Actually, I think it was at that. I don't know if it was at the 100th anniversary, but there was a tour of the station um, offered a few years ago, and I was talking with actually a married couple there at that tour, and they had served as scientists at the South Pole, and they told me that they had received WWV and used it. I believe it was 10 megahertz in calibrating some equipment there. So
Well, that's RJ. He's on this call with us right now.
nice.
Yeah, that was my wife. She did 2 full winters at the South Pole, and she both used it to calibrate instruments and to entertain herself in the middle of the winter when there was nobody to listen to.
Well, thank you, RJ. It's nice to. I think I must have met you then because I remember speaking with a man and a woman there. So
Yeah.
Yep,
nice to
yep,
nice
that
to
was
hear from you again.
yep.
That was when we had our tours back in 2023. We had the celebration for the 100th anniversary of the frequency standard. And those were incredible tours. I must tip my hat to NIST again for letting us visit WWV and to visit the lab in Boulder. And that was really fun. I know
Yeah.
RJ was there with us and getting to see the fountain clocks
Yep.
right there on the floor and getting to see the benchmark on the floor so they could measure the height of the clock off the floor and correct for uh, being farther away from the center of the earth and the slower spin that you're out in the outside. I mean, it is really kind of fun to see the detail and the you know
Yeah.
the degree of accuracy that we can get to.
Mm.
Yeah.
But
The thing that really smoked me about those fountain clocks, they had a computer display that was showing the temperature of the cesium cloud immediately after being irradiated by the lasers. And it was measured in nano degrees Kelvin. And I'd been taking pictures of everything up to that point, and some of them are in my talk that I'll be giving next month. And when I saw that, my brain just froze. I've been kicking myself ever since. I didn't take a picture of that screen.
that's funny.
Just yeah, it's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the farthest away, the listener who was farthest from the station that we received a QSL card from might have been from Perth in Western Australia. Um, Matt Matt Deutsch actually found the I think they call it the antipodal point on the globe, which is basically 180 degrees away from WWV. Um, Literally as far away as you can get from the station, and it is in the Indian Ocean. I guess it would be west of Perth. There's a point in the Indian Ocean, and so we have received QSL cards from Australia and from Perth.
That's where they'll find MH370.
Somewhere out there. That's what I
Yeah, that
understand.
too. Well, what's kind of interesting though is that our 1 watt whisper broadcast from WWVB building is also received in Antarctica, and we get those reception reports from the Whisper Network. So it is really kind of fun to think that 1 watt goes as far as 10,000 watts, and it might be harder to hear, but it gets there. So
That's interesting you say that. My son Jonathan and I we had a rig set up here at one time with a end-fed antenna on a tree in the yard, and we had a whisper operation going, and we were able to be received at I think it's the German Scientific Research Station
Right.
in Antarctica, and they talk about somewhere I read about their antenna, and it just laid on the ice there outside of their
Exactly.
facility, but it's like hundreds of feet above the ground because the surface of Antarctica, the surface of the ground is buried under a whole lot. So it's actually quite a ways off of the ground.
That's
And of course,
I
it's extremely quiet there
yes.
as far as
That
interference.
station is actually involved in working with the Hamsai group now, and they have a whisper
Nice.
transmitter down there. Instead of just a receiver, they have a transmitter.
That's
And
cool.
so they're doing the same thing that we're doing with the club broadcast from the WWV building. And so they've got that same whisper sound. We're going to get more of those transmitters around the world, and it'll be interesting to see where the science goes with what we're doing with Hamsai and how that's going to unfold. So,
Yeah, it's
Nice.
actually been noted how stable the propagation is on 25 megahertz down to the German station.
Wow.
yeah.
Impressive.
The other interesting thing is that if you listen to the announcement on the half hour, they never announced 25 megahertz on that. And so my understanding was that Matt Deutsch, when you said in 2014, you guys put it back on the air, he got a request from some ham radio operators who wanted to have that signal on there so they could study the propagation. That was the height of the last or the previous solar cycle, right about that time. And so it sort of stayed on without anybody really saying take it off, right?
Yeah, that's how I understood it as well. It was a resource that we that the station had available at the time that wasn't being used. The antenna had been actually repurposed as a 15 megahertz standby antenna. The 25 megahertz dedicated antenna had been repurposed and actually recut for 15 megahertz. But then the technicians there actually were able to install an RF switch that would allow the main 15 megahertz standby or the main 15 megahertz antenna to be used with the standby transmitter. And so instead of using the 25 megahertz, which wasn't exactly ideal for this purpose, the main antenna could be used with the standby transmitter, and that opened up or made that 25 megahertz antenna available again. It was we actually had the old pieces in the boneyard there, and we actually disassembled that antenna and reassembled it for 25 megahertz, and it worked great. So
Well, it's great that it's on. There are a
yeah,
lot of people that use it, so don't
I
take it off.
think,
mm,
Well, I'll have to talk to Matt. You don't work there
yeah,
anymore.
yeah,
I,
I
I,
think
Hey,
I remember Matt saying that the reason it's still listed as experimental is because there's no backup.
yep, I was just going to say that. That's what I heard too.
and
Okay,
isn't
But
that's great.
Glenn would
please
know
keep
this,
it
but
on. I remember when it was taken off clearly to save money during a solar minimum, saying, well, nobody listens to that. Well, just wait another few years and we do.
Yeah,
that's right.
yeah.
but Glenn isn't like Dave said that it's not on the announcement,
Mm.
but that's because you can't change that, right?
Yeah,
Wasn't that
that's
there was some problem where I remember bringing
That's
it up with
true.
Matt where
yeah,
let's change it, and he said he couldn't change it or something like that.
yeah. You're right. The audio announcement that you hear um, at the top of the hour and at 30 minutes past the hour, the station ID basically is it's recorded onto the memory on our on the time code generators there, and that memory is not accessible. We can't get into that. It's basically flashed into a some kind of processor chip, and we can't change it easily. And
Even
so,
even the address, I believe, right?
right,
Yeah.
the mailing address, 2000 East County Road 58, the post office, actually the county actually changed our mailing address from 2000 East County Road 58 years ago, about 10 years ago. They actually renumbered the streets, the roads, and the house numbers or the residence or the address numbers on that road. And now it's I believe 5703 North Highway 1 instead of 2000 East County Road 58. But again, we can't get to that audio to change it, or it's not easily accessible. And now as time goes by, there's been discussion of new time code generators, and who knows, maybe someday when we get new TCGs, then we can, and I should say they can fix that.
That's really interesting that with all the technology that we have today, you can't change that. So
Yeah.
Yeah, amazing.
The
Well,
reason we brought it up is we knew about it, Dave. We just, it should have been changed, but we couldn't.
right.
Yeah.
No, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So
Now I will say
then there's
though,
then there's the issue of the voice. The guy who does the voice, I no doubt he's long since gone, but
well,
that's a special voice sound.
yeah, there's a whole story behind the voice of WWV that the original voice, and then it was changed when we got new equipment back in the early 1990s. And um, yeah, I'm not sure if that gentleman is still around or not, but uh, I wanted to just get back to, Matt had mentioned that we don't have a backup transmitter for the 25 megahertz, and that's another reason why um, it is listed as experimental. And that is true. There is no automatic standby transmitter for 25 megahertz. At least there wasn't when I retired. And so there may be now, I'm not sure. But at the time, that was a concern. And so um, that is
fair
true.
enough.
Someone
Yeah.
brought that up.
Yeah.
I can add to
So-
I'm sorry, and just real quick. John Doyle passed away in 2023.
Ah,
And Jane Barbie, the voice of VH, passed away in 2003.
Oh, wow.
wow. Yeah, so John Doyle
Listening to
is the
dead
voice.
people.
John Doyle is the voice that you hear at WWV and Jane Barbie at VH, of course.
Wow. Very good. Hey, it's I'm looking at the clock. Can't see that. It's
One final
7:30
question. Do you think
plus 2. Yeah, let's do a couple more questions, and then I think we need to
it's
retire.
9:31 here? Do you think, Glenn, that WWV will ever convert to solid state transmitters? Because finding those tubes is starting to get a little hard.
Yes, you're right. When I left NIST, that was a definite topic of conversation. There had been some movement in that direction, and some money allocated toward in that direction, I should say. I don't know where that stands these days, and that would be a question for Matt. But it's definitely a topic, and you're right. Those tubes are getting harder to find.
Yeah,
Any
there's
other
another
questions?
consideration of that in that we're discovering that the tube transmitters have a lot of phase distortion. They're causing intermod in the modulation as we're trying to demodulate it and pick up the sidebands.
I have heard, I believe, and Mike, maybe you can comment on this, but the Hamsci folks are able to see um, differences. I believe I have this right. Maybe I should phrase it as a question, Mike. Can the Hamsci people actually see the differences in the differences in the transmitters that we broadcast from at WWV?
I'm certainly no expert on that.
Well, I could
I've
tell
heard
you,
that
yes,
talk,
we
but
can.
I don't know much about it.
No, I can tell you, yes, we can. And that 5, 10, and 15 have a phase distortion that the other ones do not. And they're
Okay.
causing the reason that this is an issue is because we're trying to discriminate between WWV and WWVH. Many of us, if not all of us, often get the two signals almost equal strength.
Mhm.
I'm in New Hampshire, and it happens all the time. except when I get WWVH and not WWV, which is a very interesting situation. But the problem is that, we're trying to watch the 500 and 600 sidebands, Hertz sidebands, and the 100 Hertz iRig sub, sub channel is causing intermodulation that makes it hard to discriminate 500 from 600.
And the solid state would make that and would improve that.
Yes. We know from looking at the other transmitters, those are much better.
I have a question for you. One of the things I remember hearing was that there was some question about whether the time of arrival measurements from all the V transmitters were in phase. Is HamSite still looking at that?
Yes, but not as directly as the actual frequency, because we're looking at Doppler shift mostly right now.
Okay.
Mike, you're asking about the phase arrival of just WWV or both?
Yeah, like for the 6V transmitters, are they all synced?
That's a good question.
Exactly.
And we would need to use the receiver near WWV to determine that, but we do have that.
Well, he was asking about WWVH too, right? Is that what you were saying?
Well, both.
No,
but
he's
I
saying
was thinking about WWV.
Yeah, across the different WWV transmitters, it's the group delay through each of them the same.
And Mike, isn't it true that WWVH has solid state transmitters?
Okay, so like I've been gone for almost 2 years, but
right.
So we bought one solid state transmitter for VH. And it's my understanding, I still occasionally see Jeff Sherman. I'll go out to dinner with him every once in a while. That it has not been installed yet because of they need to get the funding for some type of concrete pad to mount it on. It sounds like a big mess, but
we'll have to ask Steve Johnston.
Yeah, Steve. It's the transmitter is either sitting there or NIST is paying for it to be in storage from a vendor. It was purchased from Continental in Texas, but I don't know.
Well, I hope they can get it out of storage and put it into use. That would be interesting to know.
Yeah, maybe you could delete that part from the recording because I don't know.
Okay. Well, you don't work for him anymore either. You don't know any of this stuff.
Right. I guess I'm not liable. But it's not. I heard about a month ago that it wasn't installed. So.
Well, I hope they can get it in. That's all we can hope. That would be good. Yeah. All right. Any other questions? We're 40 minutes after our hour, but that's okay. It's good discussion. Thank you. Anybody else got? Glenn, go ahead.
Just want to say if anyone has further questions about the history of WWV or questions for me in particular, I'm happy to take emails. Shoot me an email. I'll be happy to get back to you on that. Also, I'm unfortunately not active right now on any frequency, but I have been known to go over to Dave's house. And my son Jonathan and I have been over there a couple of times or once or twice, and so you never know what might happen the next time there's a October 1st rolls around.
We'll get you on the air. So. We'll get you there.
We hope so.
Well, Glenn, thank you so much. It was really great having your expertise, your background, your knowledge. It's just incredible.
Well, it's my pleasure. Enjoyed it very much.
You. And everybody, thank you so much for being here this evening. I'm going to go ahead and hit the stop button a little after Mike wanted me to, but I'm going to go ahead and hit the stop button. And